By the early years of this century, passenger travel by rail had reached such a peak of excellence that some of the crack trains in the United States and Europe had become veritable hotels on wheels. Now, the first of these and the most famous was the luxurious Orient Express. It had come into service in 1883 to carry the royal and the rich across Europe from Paris to Istanbul. So romantic was everything connected with the train that when it reached the Bulgarian frontier, who should climb onto the footplate from time to time to drive it to the Turkish border but the King of Bulgaria? Yes, the King of Bulgaria himself, believe it or not. And what is more, he managed to keep the train on time. Oddly enough, the first of the so-called luxury trains to be seen in this country belonged to Rhodesia Railways. Built about 1901, they went into service on the long and exhausting haul between Cape Town and Bulawayo. From time to time, they ran excursions to the Victoria Falls, and so they became known as the Zambezi Express. Although never aspiring to the luxury of the Orient Express, the Zambezi Express nevertheless heralded the start of a new era of rail travel in southern Africa. Up to that time, Cape Town had never seen such luxury. I mean, just think of it. Apart from sleeping compartments, there were oak-paneled buffet, dining and smoking cars. There was even a card room and a small library. There were red leather settees and armchairs. There were washrooms and showers and toilets.
By this time, of course, the United States had her own legendary trains with Pullman and plush private cars for the famous and the well-to-do.
One Thursday morning in 1923, a crack luxury train pulled out of Johannesburg station, southbound on its maiden run. Less than 30 hours later, it steamed into Cape Town docks to link up with the mail ship just about to sail for England. Incidentally, on its southbound run, the train was known as the Union Limited, but on the return journey, it was known as the Union Express. They wore an impressive livery of blue and cream, and soon people began to refer to them as those blue trains. And yet it wasn't until 1946 that the Union Limited and the Union Express became officially the blue train. And by that time they were being hailed as the last word in luxury rail travel. By 1939, those early deluxe trains were using all-steel coaches, and they'd installed a newfangled American idea called air conditioning to ward off the scorching heat of the Great Karoo. Now let's see what we have for dinner. Oh yes, oyster cocktail. Soup, fillet of sole with cheese sauce, crumbed lamb chop, asparagus, that's nice, leg of pork, sirloin of beef, vegetables, puddings, ice cream, cheese and biscuits, coffee and fruit. I think we'll do very nicely. The first train meal was served on a South African train way back in 1885. It was prepared in a kitchenette and brought to the compartment. It took another 17 years for a dining car to appear on the scene. Then you could sit down and eat your meal in rail style. But remember, that was over 80 years ago. One wonders what those passengers would have thought of today's luxury blue train. The ride is superbly smooth and silent, due of course to the insulation and the air-sprung bogies running mostly on welded tracks. So, who travels in luxury like this? Foreign tourists, mostly. In fact, 8 out of 10 passengers are visitors from abroad. And many of them travel thousands of kilometers to do just this, experience the journey of a lifetime. Outsmarting, so we've been told, even the refurbished Orient Express. And we've heard of an American who's done more than 100 trips to the blue train. Well, someone once wrote a little song of praise, sent it to the system manager, and it went like this. After dining in great comfort, you stroll along to bed to find it's been made ready while you were being fed. Blue pillows and blue blankets, the sheets are blue as well. You've never had such luxury, if you the truth would tell. You cannot feel the motion, nor can you hear a sound. In fact, it's the dream train we think at last we've found. So travel by the Blue Train. It's well worth the extra fare. You'll step off clean and smiling. There is no wear and tear. How's that for a nice commercial? But while we're speeding through the night on almost silent wheels, it's very easy to forget, of course, there are other ways of going places. For instance, up there, South African air crews are charting pathways 10 kilometers above the Earth, reaching out to 5 continents.
South African Airways began, you may remember, back in 1934 with those 14-seater Ju-52s. When the war broke out in September 1939, the planes and the men who flew and maintained them were fitted out for war. So civil aviation in South Africa ground gradually to a halt, and when the war was ended, they had to begin again. First was Lockheed Lodestars, then with converted wartime Avro Yorks, making their stately 3-day progress from Johannesburg to England with 12 passengers and a crew of 4. Next came the 4-engined Douglas Skymaster, the DC-4, pioneering the Springbok service across the 10,000 kilometers that separated South Africa from England. After that, twin-engined Vickers Vikings. Then came the 58-seat gold-plate Constellations, and with them South African Airways became the first airline to offer its passengers the comfort of a fully pressurized cabin on the 28-hour flight to Europe. As someone once put it rather prettily, the longboat has now become the galleon. One day in 1952, a strange new sound was heard in the skies above Johannesburg. It was the whine of the world's first pure-jet passenger aircraft, Britain's sleek and graceful Comet 1. Just 1 year later, South African Airways became the first airline outside the United Kingdom to take them into service, using planes on lease from the British Overseas Airways Corporation. In 1955, another first, this time the first airline outside the United States to operate the fastest piston-engined aircraft in the world, the Douglas DC-7B. Now London was only 21 hours away. 1960 brought another revolution, the Boeing 707. With their 4 jet engines and spacious cabin, travel had found a new dimension, cruising at a speed of 960 kilometers an hour with 131 passengers and a crew of 12. London was no longer 21 hours away, but now a mere 13. Now it was the turn of the internal routes, with the new Boeing 727 adding a new dimension to local air travel. By this time, the Flying Springbok had begun to spread its wings in earnest, reaching out across the great oceans to the New World in the west and Australia in the east. So, what of tomorrow? For some, it could be their first glimpse of South America. For others, perhaps the skyscrapers of New York. Or it might be one of the capitals of Europe. Or again, it could be the magic of the East that's waiting for them. For no city on this earth is more than 1 day's distance from South Africa, and no 2 people living are more than 2 days flying time from each other.
With so much going on in the sky, it's very easy to forget one thing, and that is that both South African Railways and South African Airways are part of a vast organization called South African Transport Services. And apart from railways and airways, it embraces such things as harbors and pipelines and road transport and even lighthouses.
Year in, year out, all along the 2,500 sea miles of our coast, men of the lighthouse service keep a vigil throughout the night, beaming out a message to ships of all nations traveling the sea lanes around our shores. It's an interesting thought that more than 300 years ago, Commander Jan van Riebeck saw the need for some sort of light to guide ships into Table Bay at night. And so he ordered a beacon of pitch rings to be lit on the highest point of Robben Island whenever a ship of the Dutch East India Company was sighted sailing it at nightfall. But, he insisted, if you see that that ship is foreign and not Dutch, you shall extinguish your fires and show no light whatsoever. Well, the light from that beacon could be seen something like 20 kilometers out to sea, and it was the first night beacon for shipping ever lit south of the equator. And it was the forerunner of the 54 lighthouses, radio and radar beacons that stand watch over our long and sometimes perilous coastline. Looking at some of our modern harbours, it's hard to believe that there was a time not all that long ago when only ships with very shallow draft could cross the bar, and ocean-going vessels had to lie in the open roadstead, and passengers had to suffer the indignity of being lowered in iron-reinforced baskets onto the deck of a heaving lighter. It was in 1916, 6 years after Union and slap in the middle of World War I, that the Railways Administration took over control of the country's harbours. By the time the war was over, South Africa found itself desperately short of wooden sleepers, and unfortunately there wasn't a square centimetre of shipping space available to bring over from Australia the durable Jarrah wood sleepers. So there was only one thing to do: get into the shipping business, bring it over ourselves. And that's exactly what South African Railways did, with 3 very elderly prize ships handed over by the British. Well, in course of time, it was possible to replace these old tubs with 3 new ships, the Aloe, the Erica, and the Dahlia. And before very long, all 3 were carrying coal to Ceylon, Malaya, and the Philippines, and returning laden with all sorts of merchandise, timber, fibre, rice from Burma and Siam and the Philippines, and even China. At the peak of their maritime venture, in the middle of World War II, this time Railways had 12 ships plying the sea lanes of the world, and it was only in 1955, after 40 years of service, that this strange saga came to an end. 1 year later, that's to say in 1956, Israel went to war with Egypt, and Britain and France joined in. So the Suez Canal was closed and all shipping was diverted around the Cape. Within months, Durban became the busiest port in all Africa. By that time, the Sturrock graving dock in Cape Town harbour had been built and could accommodate, so they said, the biggest ship afloat. Today, of course, the canal is open once again. Yet there's a new energy within our ports, poised, it seems, to become the market of the future. It's all so simple. Off the ship, onto a truck, off the truck, and onto your doorstep, with something like 500,000 containers passing through Durban harbour every year. But most remarkable of all is surely this: a vast inland port at city-deep Johannesburg, 600 kilometers from the nearest stretch of sea. Yet there is one port that outshines them all. It's this gigantic coal export terminal at Richards Bay, and it handles more cargo than all the other South African ports put together.
When Cecil Rhodes's railway was extended to the Lower Congo, and the Benguela Railway to Lobito was completed round about 1928, Southern Africa found itself astride one of the most comprehensive railway networks in the world, which led Lord Buxton, a former Governor-General, to prophesy that the more direct and intimate the contacts between the countries of Africa, the sounder and more friendly would their general relationships become. Well, of course, it hasn't quite worked out that way. And yet, South African transport services have managed to maintain relations with the transport services of all southern African countries, right up to Zaire, with one exception, of course, Angola. Now, how have they managed to do this? We're railwaymen, they say. We understand one another. Of course, for most of Southern Africa, that's perhaps just as well, because without South African help, their rail systems would almost certainly have ground to a halt. Often the only channel open with our neighboring countries is the one provided by our transport services, on a purely business basis. I mean, take the case of Zimbabwe. While the two governments remain aloof, our transport services are calmly repairing Zimbabwe's rolling stock and training her air crews and train drivers. And then there's Zambia. You may remember some years ago she went to great lengths to establish her own link with the sea at Dar es Salaam. And yet she channels much of her exports and most of her imports through South African harbors. What about Mozambique? There our transport people act as advisors, they repair locomotives, and they maintain the aircraft with that country's airline. Now, there's a word for this sort of arrangement, and it's transport diplomacy. And the reasoning behind it is perfectly simple. It's good for business. And it's an interesting thought, you know, that at any one time, up to 7,000 South African railway wagons can be running through neighboring countries.
70 years or so ago, vast areas of this country were without a railway or other form of regular commercial transport. And the problem was how to bring these outlying districts into the framework of the South African economy. The Railways Administration pondered over this for a while and in the end came up with a solution: road transport. And so, one December day in 1912, a first cautious step was taken, with a road service between Bot River and Hermanus, a distance of just 32 kilometers. Soon the railway bus became as familiar a sight on the country's roads as the ox wagon used to be. In the beginning there was no such thing as lorries in South Africa, so railways had to bring them in, the first people in this country to do so. And if roads didn't exist where they were needed, then railways set to and built them at their own expense.
On the metal rails, in the air above, and on the roads beneath, South African railways were on the move. By the mid-1930s, the first of the luxury coaches. Almost from the day they came into existence, South African railways have been firm believers in the old adage, it pays to advertise. And so it's not surprising to find, as early as 1920, their publicity department opening a branch in London. Of course, one has to remember, those are the days long before the era of air travel and the package tour. And anyone who'd never left the shores of Britain or the United States, to them, South Africa was a land of mystery, something straight out of the pages of King Solomon's Mines or Prester John.
It was the stuff of which advertisers' dreams are made, for it opened a gateway to adventure and the holiday of a lifetime.
By this time, the railways had begun to organize special trains and tours for visitors. The chief steward on one of these trains records that the Americans were the most appreciative travelers of all and were particularly impressed with the catering on South African trains. He remembers on one occasion the Americans carried the chef shoulder high through the saloon in appreciation of his culinary expertise. Perhaps even more ambitious than their films was a series of paintings the publicity department commissioned to appear in prestige publications overseas. Sadly, we shall never see that sight again. Mighty steam expresses charging into the night. For over 100 years, steam spearheaded the great drive that opened up this country of ours. And steam lovers everywhere cannot but mourn its passing.
But not all of the steam engines have been pensioned off. Here and there, some are still hard at work, although their days are numbered.
Is it any wonder then that steam enthusiasts come here from all over the world? For a few unforgettable days each year, railways make it possible for them to experience all the sights and sounds and smells of yesteryear by running special steam safaris over some of the most exciting railway routes within southern Africa. And the memory of those journeys into the past is often frozen for the future in magnificent books like this. So the great steam trek is nearly over, sacrificed on the altar of efficiency. In the beginning, the plan was to switch from steam to diesel power, and for that no overhead lines were required. But then had come the oil crisis of the 70s. The answer was
electric power. After all, we had all the coal we needed to fuel the power stations, turn the turbines, haul the trains.
And the railways of tomorrow, what does the future hold for them? Technology is the answer, and it's already pointing the way ahead. Look, for example, at this automatic marshalling yard at Centrarant near Bapsfontein in the Transvaal.
Built to relieve the busy commuter lines around Johannesburg of heavy goods traffic, computers here are working hand in hand with human skills to sort the trains and assemble them in what is regarded as one of the achievements of railway technology.
Hier gaan 513 al gery by jou. Ik heb er een paar beplan, praat met die GVB alsjeblieft. Dan heb ik het 1012 voor jou met de 120 aste.
Hou net 'n minuut aan asseblief.
124 aste. 20
Centralized traffic control. It's something railwaymen have been dreaming about for years, and now it's a reality. With computers talking to one another, directing and monitoring the movements of every truck and every train on every main line throughout the entire South African railway system.
And then there's electrification. Here the aim is that by 1989, 85% of the South African railway system will be powered by electricity.
For example, there's the vital coal line to the harbour at Richards Bay. When the present route has been regraded and new locomotives introduced, it will be able to carry trains of 21,000 gross tons, the heaviest electrically hauled loads on narrow gauge anywhere in the world. Not only heavier loads, but faster trains. That's what South Africa is planning for the future. As it happens, these high speeds have only been made possible by our South African railway engineers' revolutionary invention, the Sheffel bogie. This Sheffel bogie finally overcomes the limits placed upon our present railway system by the narrow gauge inherited from the Cape more than 100 years ago. It paves the way for speeds more in keeping with the pace of the hustling days ahead, already reaching 245 kilometers an hour on test.
But this is only the beginning of our railway's second century. Who among us would be bold enough to forecast what the next 100 years will bring?